For most of history, decisions were made by people. Judgment, experience, instinct. But in the mid-20th century, that quietly changed. A government experiment proved that human judgment could be overridden, not by force, not by orders, but by numbers. After this experiment, military leaders stopped trusting intuition. Governments stopped relying on experts alone. Even life and death decisions were handed to models, systems, and probabilities. What's unsettling isn't that the experiment worked. It's that once the results came in, decision-making was never the same again. And most people have no idea it ever happened. When World War II ended, the United States found itself in a position no nation had ever occupied before. It had unmatched military power, unprecedented technology, and a new kind of fear. The next war wouldn't be fought with trenches and timelines. It would be fought with seconds. Nuclear weapons had changed the math of survival. A single wrong decision could mean catastrophe, and the people in charge knew something uncomfortable. Human judgment was not reliable enough anymore. So the government did something radical. It decided to study decision-making itself. In 1946, the US Air Force quietly funded a research group that would later become known as the RAND Corporation. Its purpose wasn't to build weapons. It was to answer a more dangerous question. How should decisions be made when the cost of being wrong is the end of everything? RAND gathered mathematicians, physicists, economists, and strategists, not generals, not politicians. People who thought in probabilities. And that's where the experiment began. One of the most influential ideas to emerge from RAND was something deceptively simple. Instead of asking, "What do we think will happen?" they asked, "What is the probability of each outcome?" And instead of choosing the option that felt right, they chose the one with the highest statistical advantage, even if it went against intuition. To test this, RAND researchers began running simulated decision experiments. Thousands of hypothetical scenarios, millions of variables, randomized outcomes, repeated again and again. This approach became known as Monte Carlo simulation. At first, it was just math. Then it started beating human judgment. When RAND compared human decisions to probabilistic models, the results were uncomfortable. Again and again, the models performed better. They were colder, less confident, more cautious, but they were right more often. Human experts overestimated their ability to predict outcomes. They relied on experience that didn't scale to unprecedented situations. They trusted patterns that no longer applied. The experiment revealed something deeply unsettling. Confidence was not the same as accuracy. By the early 1950s, the implications became clear. If probabilistic models made better choices under uncertainty, then critical decisions should no longer be made by individuals. They should be made by systems. This changed everything. Military planning shifted. Nuclear strategy relied on simulations, not generals' instincts. Cost-benefit analysis replaced moral certainty. Risk became something to be calculated, not debated. A new phrase entered government language: rational decision-making. But rational no longer meant human. What started as a Cold War experiment didn't stay there. The same decision models moved into economics, public policy, infrastructure planning, corporate strategy. Executives stopped asking, "What do we think?" They asked, "What does the model say?" And slowly, responsibility shifted. When decisions were questioned, leaders could point to the numbers. It wasn't their judgment. It was the system. This was the real outcome of the experiment. Not better decisions, but detached decisions. Once probability replaced judgment, accountability changed. Choices were no longer owned, they were justified. If something went wrong, it wasn't a mistake. It was an acceptable risk. And that idea reshaped the modern world. There was no announcement, no public debate, no vote. The experiment didn't end. It became the default. Because once decision-making was framed as a math problem, going back to intuition felt irresponsible. Even dangerous. The system worked just enough to make itself permanent. And that leaves a question most people never ask. If our most important decisions are made by models built on assumptions, who is responsible when those assumptions are wrong? By the late 1950s, probabilistic decision-making was no longer an experiment. It was policy. Military planners trusted simulations more than instinct. Governments relied on models to estimate casualties, escalation, and acceptable loss. Risk was no longer debated emotionally, it was calculated. On paper, it was progress. In reality, it introduced a new kind of danger. The first cracks appeared when theory collided with human behavior. Probabilistic models assumed rational actors. They assumed decisions would follow incentives, deterrence would work predictably, and escalation would stop at calculated thresholds. But humans didn't behave like equations. They panicked. They misread signals. They made decisions under fear. And no model could fully account for that. In October 1962, the world came closer to catastrophe than most people realize. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, US and Soviet leaders relied heavily on probabilistic assessments to guide their decisions. Analysts calculated acceptable risks, predicted responses, and modeled escalation scenarios. According to the models, certain actions were unlikely to trigger full-scale conflict. What the models didn't account for were unknowns. Unreported submarine commanders. Miscalculated radar signals. Human judgment under extreme stress. At least one Soviet officer refused to follow protocol, a decision that likely prevented disaster. No model predicted that. After the crisis, internal reviews revealed something unsettling. The models hadn't failed. They had done exactly what they were designed to do. They calculated acceptable probabilities, even when those probabilities involved the end of the world. This exposed a core flaw. When decisions are reduced to numbers, catastrophe can become statistically tolerable. A 1% chance of annihilation looks small on paper. In reality, it's everything. As probabilistic systems spread, accountability changed. Before, a leader made a choice and owned the outcome. After the experiment, decisions were model-supported. If something went wrong, responsibility diffused. The assumptions were flawed. The inputs were incomplete. The probabilities were misinterpreted. No single person was at fault. The system had decided. Despite close calls, governments didn't abandon these models. They doubled down. Because the alternative, returning to intuition alone, felt worse. Models offered consistency, documentation, justification. They made decisions defensible. And defensibility became more important than certainty. What began as Cold War strategy quietly expanded outward. The same logic appeared in economic forecasting, urban planning, public health policy, corporate decision-making. Algorithms and models began influencing decisions that affected millions of lives. Most people never noticed the shift. But the mindset was the same. If the numbers support it, it must be the right choice. History didn't stop offering warnings. Financial crises occurred despite low probability assessments. Infrastructure failures happened despite favorable projections. Policies backfired even when models predicted success. Each time, the explanation was familiar. No one had violated the system. Reality had. The experiment didn't remove humans from decision-making. It changed how humans justify decisions. Today, leaders rarely say, "I believe this is the right choice." They say, "The data supports it." That shift matters, because belief implies responsibility. Data implies inevitability. We now live in a world shaped by that original experiment. A world where decisions feel impersonal, responsibility feels distant, outcomes feel unavoidable. The models are powerful, but they are only as good as the assumptions behind them. And assumptions are human. The experiment that changed how decisions were made didn't fail. It succeeded. It proved that probability could outperform instinct, but at a cost. When judgment is replaced by models, certainty disappears. When accountability is shared with systems, responsibility becomes harder to locate. The world didn't become safer or more dangerous. It became calculated. And we've been living with that calculation ever since. If you want more true history documentaries about the quiet experiments that reshaped power, policy, and everyday life, subscribe to the channel. Because the most important changes rarely happen in public. They happen in the way decisions are made.